privilege to guide us all through this next set of speakers. The upcoming presentations are all about celebrating 50 years of women in naval aviation. 2023 marks the 50th anniversary of the first class of women naval aviators. We are privileged to have with us today some of those living legends. I'll ask you to please save questions for after the presentations. We're going to do a panel, and we'll get those at that time. Our first speaker for this portion, celebrating 50 years of women in naval aviation, is a trailblazer who became the U.S. Navy's 4th female naval aviator and the first female naval helicopter pilot when she received her wings at HT-18 in 1974. During her career, she successfully challenged the federal law excluding women from serving on board U.S. Navy ships. She also became the first woman assigned to flying duty on a U.S. Navy vessel. She would later become the first female combat search and rescue helicopter aircraft commander, conducting 7 rescues during her career. In 2017, she was inducted into the Women in Aviation International Pioneer Hall of Fame. Please help me welcome this naval aviation legend, Captain Joellen Drag Oslund.
Thank you so much. It is such a joy and an honor to be here today. Thank you, Lieutenant Kennedy, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Captain Newman, for inviting me to speak here today. I also want to thank every one of you here in the audience for being here today. It's not often that trailblazers like myself and Captain Griffin get to look out over a room like this and see the result of our legacy. And I'm so very grateful and fortunate to have that experience here today. I'd like to start my presentation with a short video. Hopefully that's all queued up.
In January 1973, 8 female trainees were selected to train as United States Naval aviators. 4 months later, the women reported to Pensacola, Florida for flight training. 6 of the original 8 women went on to earn their wings of gold and became the first women to be designated full-fledged military pilots. The first class of women naval aviators includes Judith Newfer, Barbara Allen, Jane Skiles, Anna Marie Scott, Joellen Drag, and Rosemary Mirams. These dedicated women became fully integrated into their squadrons, eventually commanding some of these units. While there were difficult circumstances along the way, these 6 women persevered and made lasting contributions. Their success made it possible for subsequent female naval aviators. These 6 pioneers clearly demonstrated that women had the physical and mental capacity to fly not just naval aircraft, but perform all military missions. Their success set an example for the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, and U.S. Coast Guard to emulate. These services subsequently opened pilot training to women, forever changing the face of military aviation. Their courage and determination in the air, at sea, and on the ground paved the way for all future female military aviators by constantly being first women in opening new aircraft types and missions. Some 19 years later, the opportunity for women to fly all types of aircraft in the military inventory became a reality. Standing on the shoulders of the WASP, their successes proved the ability of women to fly and serve their country anytime, anywhere.
That was the video that played at the induction of the first class of 6 women naval aviators into the Women in Aviation Pioneer Hall of Fame in Orlando in March of 2017. It's hard for me to believe, but the 50-year anniversary of women flying in the Navy is here. Back in January, Chief of Naval Air Forces Navy embarked on a year-long commemoration of this anniversary, and part of that celebration has included an all-women Navy pilot flyover of 4 combat jets at Super Bowl 57 in February, where the pilots and the ground support crew were honored on the field and on the Jumbotron at halftime. And this is a photo of First Lady Jill Biden greeting me and the pilots and the support crew in her hospitality suite. She was extremely gracious and generous with her time, even though her team lost that day. And in March, the women military aviators gathered in El Centro, California, to commemorate the Blue Angels' first air show of 2023 with Lieutenant Commander Amanda Lee, the first woman to fly as a pilot as part of the jet demonstration team. And it was an honor and a thrill to be present at both of these events. And of course, Amanda will be flying this weekend at the Homecoming Air Show. In March of 1973, 3 active duty women officers began naval aviator flight training right here at Naval Air Station Pensacola. Only 4 months before that, then Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Zumwalt had released the naval message that opened pilot training to women. And the next 3 women to begin training followed in June of '73. I'm proud to be one of those women, and together we have become known as the First Six. There were many events and factors that led up to Admiral Zumwalt's decision to expand opportunities for women in the Navy. To understand them, we need to go back to the 1940s and World War II, which had many parallels for women of the 70s. As the United States entered World War II, the military faced a shortage of manpower, and women were suddenly needed for many jobs that had previously been considered unthinkable, including military service. We are all familiar with the Rosie the Riveter posters of the women who served the war effort as civilians. And many other women joined the military, including my own mother, who served in the U.S. Marine Corps. And here she is with my father in Washington, D.C. in 1947. But there was another group of women who filled far more dangerous and daring jobs in World War II, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs. From 1942 to 1944, there were 1,074 WASPs who qualified as pilots in military aircraft. They were trained to fly and transport every plane that the military flew at that time, and 38 of them gave their lives fulfilling that mission. But because they were not considered to be military members at the time, under the guidelines, a fallen WASP had to be buried at family expense without traditional honors or even an official letter acknowledging her sacrifice. The Army wouldn't even allow the U.S. flag to be placed on their coffin. In December of 1944, the remaining living WASPs were all sent home with a verbal thank you. They had no military benefits, no veteran status, and even had to pay their own way to get back home. And with their disbandment, a brave new chapter in women's equality abruptly ended. Fast forward 30 years to the early 70s, and the military services were facing many of the same manpower shortages that they had seen in World War II. For the Navy and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Zumwalt, the answer to those manpower shortages once again was women. The early 70s were an exciting time for women, and a lot of barriers were coming down. The Equal Rights Amendment looked like it would pass. Of course, we're still waiting for that. And women were beginning to make advances in higher education and the workforce, thanks to Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited employment discrimination, quote, because of sex, a phrase that was added almost as a joke to that historic legislation in hopes that it would lead to its defeat. Another important but little appreciated event at the time was the passage of Title IX, a comprehensive federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any federally funded education or program or activity, and that included sports. In addition, the Vietnam War was nearly over, and the military draft was scheduled to end in 1973, which created the need for the all-volunteer force. Admiral Zumwalt was a very forward-thinking CNO, and he didn't like waiting around for studies or committees or congressional action to solve his pressing manpower needs. He was well known for sending out major policy changes in the form of Chief of Naval Operations messages directly to the fleet. They were nicknamed Z-grams. In August of 1972, Admiral Zumwalt issued ZGRAM 116, Equal Rights and Opportunities for Women. It was a huge step forward for women in the Navy, both officer and enlisted, and it opened up ratings and specialties to women that had previously been closed and denied to them. In retrospect, from our vantage point 50 years later, ZGRAM 116 and the subsequent opening of Navy flight training to women was perhaps one of the most enduring and far-reaching effects of Admiral Zumwalt's legacy, not only for the Navy, but for all of the services. And yet, it barely rated a one-sentence mention in his memoir, On Watch. In November of '72, Admiral Zumwalt issued the follow-up message, ZGRAM 116, and opened Navy flight training to women for a trial program. And it was this message that a friend placed in my hands in November of '72 and said, "You should go for this." The popular message of the '70s was that women could do anything, but the reality was quite different. It was still difficult to break into non-traditional jobs, and the promise of women's equality hadn't really reached the mainstream, and it particularly hadn't reached men. Women's lib was definitely in its infancy. And this Young Miss magazine cover illustrates the mixed messages of the times. You can be a Navy pilot, but wouldn't you really rather be a cheerleader? The article about me was near the very end, right after the cookie recipes. And now, 50 years later, women can do both. And this is a photo of the Navy combat pilots who conducted the first ever all-woman flyover at the Super Bowl last February, posing here with the Philadelphia Eagles cheerleaders at halftime. People often ask me, whatever made you think that you could do it? And I'll be honest, to some extent, I just had no idea what I was getting into. My childhood as a Navy brat definitely prepared me in some ways, as did my parents, especially my mother, who encouraged my sisters and brother and me never to be afraid and to try anything. In high school and college, training and jumping horses became my passion. Loading hay and shoveling horse manure would later serve me very well in the Navy on many different levels. And it was those experiences that made me think maybe I could do this. With C&O Zumwalt's message in hand, I went down to the local Navy recruiter, who hadn't yet seen the message and didn't actually believe that it was legitimate. He asked me to return the next day, and my reception was far more welcoming. After passing the written flight aptitude exam and doing a round of publicity photos, I was off to Women Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island in mid-January of 1973. I used to be rather embarrassed by this photo that appeared on the front page of the Chronicle in San Francisco. But you know, mini skirts and go-go boots were in back then, so now I've decided to own it. My women officer class was the last one to be gender segregated, yet another sign that steps were being taken to equalize opportunities for women. And it was in Women Officer School that I met 3 of the other women who had been selected for pilot training: Jane Skiles, Anna Maria Scott, and Rosemary Merriams. As the CNO's message directed, of the 8 women who were selected, 4 were women on active duty or already in Women Officer School, and 4 were recruited from civilian life, like myself. And coincidentally, this photo from Women Officer School of my company was taken next to an H-3 helicopter, which was the last model that I flew when I was in the Navy. 2 of the aviation candidates eventually dropped out, and that left 6 of us to complete pilot training. And after receiving my commission as an ensign in May of '73, it was off to Pensacola for flight training. It was a big relief to meet some of the other women, but because of class schedules and company assignments, we didn't really get to spend a lot of time together. In fact, after aviation ground school in Pensacola, Florida, we almost never saw each other again. Essentially, we all went through our flight training alone. And this photo shows Jane Skiles O'Day, Barbara Ellen Rainey, Judith Newfer-Bruner, and myself, the first 4 women to complete flight training. Since Admiral Zumwalt had opened naval aviation to women by decree and declared it a trial program, not a lot of thought had been given to the little details like flight gear that might fit us, appropriate uniforms for physical training. We only had dress blue uniforms with straight skirts and heels, and whether the physical fitness standards were to be adjusted or to remain the same as they were for the men. We were the guinea pigs, And we quickly found out that the Navy was very concerned, and by that I mean completely obsessed, with our supposed lack of physical strength, particularly upper body strength. It's hard for young women today to imagine, but women's sports programs in high school and college were virtually non-existent in the 60s and 70s. Women were not expected or encouraged to be physically fit, and in many cases, actively discouraged. When women first tried to enter the Boston Marathon in 1966, the American Athletic Union believed that it was physiologically impossible for women to run that far because it would damage their reproductive organs and cause them to become muscle-bound and grow hair on their chest. As Bobby Gibb, the first woman to unofficially finish the Boston Marathon in 1966, would later say very bluntly, they were afraid our uterus would fall out. And when Kathrine Schweitzer tried to run the marathon in 1967, a race organizer physically assaulted her and tried to forcibly remove her from the race. She managed to finish anyway. And by the way, Bobby Gibb finished in a respectable 3 hours and 21 minutes wearing a bathing suit, her brother's Bermuda shorts, and boys' running shoes, because they didn't make running shoes for women back then. And it wasn't until 1972, the year before I started flight training, that the Boston Marathon was officially opened to women. As I mentioned earlier, thanks to Title IX, women's sports programs took a huge leap forward in the 70s, and with it, women's physical fitness and their access to competitive sports programs. When the first 6 of us were ready to enter training, the Navy had not had time to study how the physical fitness standards might be modified or if they would just remain the same. So the 6 of us just did our best. And this photo shows Barb and Judy wearing their dress blues and heels, standing in the sand in front of the obstacle course climbing walls, and probably wondering if the Navy was even thinking about appropriate physical fitness gear for women. My flight training started with the T-34 at Sofley Field and was followed by basic training in the T-28 at Whiting Field. And after that, of course, as you all know, the pilots are selected for their training for their pipeline, jets, multi-engine, or helicopter. The Navy planned to put 3 women in props and 3 women in helicopters. We were not allowed in jets because of the federal statutes in place at the time that prohibited women from flying combat aircraft, and all jets were automatically assumed to be combat aircraft. I really had no preference, and I thought helos sounded like an amazing opportunity. And for my very first helicopter flight, I knew I was in the right place. I have several enduring memories of my flight training. I'll share one of them with you. One of my funniest memories is the day I had to fly 3 45-minute training hops back to back to back in the T-28. They were very anxious to get us through the flight training program, so if there was one hole in the sky, one instructor pilot, and one airplane available, we were in it. And my flight was delayed, and I had consumed 1 too many glasses of iced tea. And just as depicted in the movie Hidden Figures, the nearest women's restroom was 2 buildings away from the ready room, and that was the last place you wanted to be when your instructor pilot shows up and calls out your name. After more than a couple of hours in the ready room and 1.5 hours in the air, I was desperate for a bathroom. The T-28 had a relief tube for the male pilots to use while flying, so I thought I'd give that a try. But unfortunately, it was stuck under the seat and would not reach far enough for me to even think about using it. But wanting to do the right thing for my fellow male pilots, I wrote up the discrepancy after the flight. Relief tube, too short. And it was no coincidence that I was assigned that same aircraft the next day, and the maintenance sign-off was, "Pilot is using wrong equipment." In the end, I survived it all. And since the Navy was anxious to get us out of training and into the real Navy, I finished the 13-month program in just 10 months. I received my Wings of Gold in April of 1974 as the 4th woman naval aviator and the 1st woman pilot. I was 4 months short of my 21st birthday, and I was still an ensign. My first duty station was Helicopter Combat Support Squadron 3 at NAS North Island, flying the Boeing H-46 Sea Knight. I was a bit intimidated the first time I saw the 46 because it was huge, but I found out that it was a dream to fly, and I had absolutely no trouble with it. My reception in the squadron was actually pretty good. Thanks to Z-Gram 116, they already had enlisted women assigned, and some were even in the maintenance department repairing the helos and training to become search and rescue air crewmen. And there was also one other female officer who worked in the admin department. For the most part, my commanding officers and my fellow pilots were very supportive. What was a major problem, as I quickly discovered, was Federal Law 10 U.S. Code, Section 6015, which stated that Navy women, quote, may not be assigned an aircraft that are engaged in combat missions, nor may they be assigned to duty on vessels of the Navy other than hospital ships and transports. In 1974, there were no transport ships left in the Navy, and the only hospital ship was on the East Coast. And ironically, I sailed on one of the Navy's last transport ships when I was 8 years old, and my family was transferred to the Philippines. The history behind Section 6015 is very interesting. After the experiences of World War II and the WASPs in particular, the military services were committed to maintaining and even expanding the role of women in the military and putting those changes into law. In the congressional record in 1948, the Navy actually proposed allowing women to serve aboard ships. Congress would have none of it. In particular, Congressman Carl Vinson, the powerful head of the House Armed Services Committee, was vehemently opposed to allowing women to serve on ships or fly aircraft on the grounds that it exposed them to combat. Just fix it so they cannot go to sea at all, he said in congressional testimony. And Section 6015 was a resulting law, and the reason I wasn't even allowed to hover over a ship that was anchored off the coast of San Diego, and why the 6 of us were initially not allowed carrier landing training or to fly jets because they were all considered combat aircraft. In a karmic little bit of history, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Carl Vinson, that bears the congressman's name, was one of the first combatant ships to have a gender-integrated crew in the 80s after 6015 was modified. And additionally, in 2012, the Navy's first all-woman E-2C Hawkeye crew flew a combat mission from the Vinson. They were members of Carrier Airborne Early Warning Squadron 125 embarked on the carrier. And that flight may have been one of the first unmanned missions from a U.S. carrier. Realizing that 6015 was preventing me from doing even the basic mission of my squadron, and that it would severely curtail any career opportunities, I started looking for ways to change the law. Our squadron hangar happened to be across the street from our wing commander's office, and just down the road from his boss, the Commander, Naval Air Forces Pacific. So doing anything under the radar really was not an option. In March of 1976, I began by writing a letter requesting shipboard deployment to the Secretary of the Navy via the chain of command. My commanding officer gave it a favorable endorsement, sent it up the road to the wing commander, and that was the last I ever heard of it. Clearly, a polite request submitted in accordance with Navy regulations was not going to have any effect. I soon found out that the American Civil Liberties Union had already filed suit on behalf of 4 Navy enlisted women who were challenging the constitutionality of Section 6015. A couple months later, I added my name as a plaintiff to the lawsuit, along with 2 other women officers, and I was the only aviator among the 6 plaintiffs. I continued flying at HC3 until 1977 and qualified as a helicopter aircraft commander. I flew many special mission ops and I learned how to vert rep on land, but I was never allowed to land on or deploy aboard a ship until the very end of my tour. I finally got a shipboard landing qualification during my last 2 months because during the discovery process for the lawsuit, the Navy denied that it had ever prohibited women from landing aboard ship, which was certainly news to my commanding officers and all the other women pilots. And that ship landing qualification proved crucial at my next duty station, Naval Air Station Point Mugu. Rot. While at HC3, of course, I was under the close watch of the wing type and fleet commanders, but it was the wild, wild west at Point Mugu. Nobody was keeping an eye on anything out there. I was assigned to the... Is it still that way? I was assigned to the operations department as a helo pilot, where our primary missions were search and rescue and weapons test and evaluation support, which involved primarily target drone recoveries from the Pacific Ocean off Point Mugu. Target drone recovery is a pretty risky mission. There were a lot of things that can go wrong and frequently did. The targets often got lost, or the harnesses wouldn't deploy, or that they would partially sink. On one of my recoveries, the drone harness didn't set quite properly, and the drone began flying back and forth at the end of the pendant underneath the helo. Of course, we had to let it go and release it, and we watched as a few $100,000 worth of drones skipped across the water like a stone on a pond and disintegrated into 1,000 pieces. That one wasn't going to live to fly another day. My first rescue involved a small civilian plane flying to Bakersfield that crashed in a steep snow-covered canyon in the mountains north of Ventura, killing 2 of the 3 people on board. The lone survivor managed to stay alive on melted snow and insects for almost a week before the Civil Air Patrol found him in a steep canyon. I happened to have SAR duty that weekend, and we were called in to rescue the survivor. And once on scene, which was at about 6,000 feet of altitude, we hovered with the rotor arc only a few feet from the canyon wall and lowered 2 crewmen about 100 feet down to the crash site. We hovered out of ground effect for what seemed like forever before we hoisted the survivor on board. He had broken both wrists in the crash, but he was in surprisingly good shape considering all he had been through. And this is a photo of our crew after we were presented the rescue citation from Boeing. In July of 1978, while I was stationed at Point Mugu, Judge John Sirica from the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., handed down his decision on 6015, declaring it unconstitutional. And that cleared the way for me to be able to officially land aboard ships and deploy. But the problem was, we almost never did that at Point Mugu. But then fate intervened. In November of '78, a big naval exercise was scheduled about 400 miles off the coast of Southern California, and they needed drone recovery crews and 2 helicopters to go aboard the amphibious assault ship USS Vancouver. I immediately volunteered, and because of my last-minute shipboard landing haul in HC-3, I was one of the few pilots who was current for shipboard landings. In late 1978, I flew aboard for my first and only ship deployment, and the next 6 days became among the most unforgettable of my life. On our 4th day at sea, the drones were launched, and our first helicopter went after the first drone. I took off in the second helicopter to get the next one, and we recovered it and returned it to the Vancouver, and then launched to await airborne for the next target. But unbeknownst to us, our first helicopter was having a lot of problems recovering their drone, which had partially sunk. We hadn't heard them on the radios for quite a while, so we climbed up to raise them or to see them visually. It worked, and we spotted them a few miles away, but they were still very low over the water. And as we got closer, we saw a huge surge of rotor spray, and I knew instantly that they had landed in the water. We circled helplessly while they tried to take off with only one of their 2 engines working, and we watched as all 3 crewmen exited out the back of the downed helo. The remaining engine was shut down, and the helo rolled over on its side and began to sink. And finally, to our great relief, the 2 pilots popped out of the cockpit from the starboard emergency exit. We hoisted all 5 crew members into our helo and returned them to the ship. And after launching to recover several more targets, we were finally done for the day. As I made my way through the ship to sickbay to check on our rescued crew, I was suddenly stopped by a member of the ship's crew who came to attention, gave me a salute, and said, "I owe you an apology, ma'am." My surprise, I asked, why? He told me he had been watching our flight ops from the signal bridge when the helo went down. And apparently there had been some very spirited wagering among the crew concerning whether it had been me who crashed the helicopter. I gathered the odds were not in my favor. In the crewman's words, "We all thought you did it," and that included the captain of the ship. I went on to fly pretty much nonstop for the next 2 days, and we recovered many, many more targets, and some of them were very close to the Vancouver. I could see the crew lining the rails and taking pictures. At least I was pretty sure they weren't betting against me anymore. My 2 years at Point Mugu were very exciting ones, but it was becoming clear to me that while I had fought a battle and 6015 had been modified to allow for some shipboard duty, opportunities weren't going to be available to me soon enough to make up for the career milestones that I had already missed. My career path and promotion opportunities did not look promising on active duty. So in late 1979, I made the decision to leave active duty and continue my career in the Naval Reserve. And for the next 5 years, I was fortunate to fly with HC-9 a Navy Air Reserve Squadron whose primary mission was, ironically, combat search and rescue, flying the Sikorsky H-3 Sea King. And it was during this tour that I got my 7th and final rescue when we picked up a Marine jet pilot who ejected from his A4 just off the coast. And while flying with HC-9, I had the rare opportunity to land aboard my husband's ship, the USS Bellawood, where he was assigned as the aircraft handler. For the remainder of my reserve career, I followed my husband's active duty assignments, serving in the Pentagon at the Navy Command Center, and later with Commander Fleet Air Mediterranean Reserve Unit out of New Orleans and Naples. And those tours were followed by various assignments in Hawaii, Florida, and San Francisco. And I retired as a captain after 25 years of service in 1998. With the repeal of 6015 in 1993 that allowed Navy women to fly combat aircraft, and the lifting of all combat restrictions across all the services in 2016, women's opportunities have increased exponentially, of course, since the 70s. All the military service academies were finally open to women 2 years after I got my wings in 1976. And all the services, including the Coast Guard, have thousands of women serving in all types of aviation positions as pilots, flight officers, mission specialists, flight surgeons, maintenance technicians, and air crew. Women have commanded carrier and expeditionary strike groups and numbered fleets, and of course have promoted all the way to 4-star admiral. 20 of our 63 astronauts have served in the U.S. military, including Captain Kay Heyer, whose story you will hear in just a few minutes. Here's a photo of Nicole Mann, astronaut class of 2013. Last March, she returned from a 5-month mission aboard the International Space Station as SpaceX Crew 5 commander. Nicole completed astronaut training in 2015 and became the first female commander of a NASA commercial crew program launch in 2022. And she's also selected to be among the 9 women trained to land on the moon as a member of NASA's Artemis team. And here is Colonel Nicole Mann, Marine Corps FA-18 Hornet pilot. Nicole is the daughter-in-law of Captain John Mann, one of my HC-3 squadron mates. I'm sure that when John and I were flying together in HC-3 back in the 1970s, he never dreamed that his future daughter-in-law would someday be a Marine colonel, a jet fighter pilot, a Navy test pilot, and an astronaut. In August of 2021, of course, Captain Amy Baron-Schmidt became the first woman to power a nuclear aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln. Amy also started her career as a helicopter pilot at North Island. And Rear Admiral Shoshana Chatfield has been nominated for appointment to Vice Admiral and for assignment to the 3-star military position of U.S. military representative to the NATO Military Committee. And Admiral Chatfield also began her Navy career as a helicopter pilot, with assignments to helicopter combat support squadrons flying the H-3 and the H-46, the 2 helicopters that I flew during my career. And she has been most recently assigned as the president of the Naval War College. She and I were privileged to attend the U.S. Open tennis tournament in September as part of the United States Tennis Association's Military Appreciation Day, which is a celebration honoring military veterans and 50 years of equal pay for women tennis players and 50 years of women flying in the Navy. And while there, we were privileged and honored to meet Billie Jean King. It's taken a long, long time to get to this point, and it took 20 years just for us to get a level playing field when 6015 was finally repealed in its entirety in 1993. And there were many times the first 6 of us did not think that that would ever happen. And in fact, in 1993, the women in the Navy flight program was hanging by a thread, and it could have gone either way at that time. And of course, with opportunity comes risk. And we have lost women pilots in aircraft accidents and in combat, including Lieutenant Commander Barbara Rainey, the first woman to earn her wings of gold. Barbara perished in a training accident in 1982. And sadly, last year, we lost 2 more of our pioneering first 6. Captain Jane Skiles O'Day, Woman Naval Aviator number 3, passed away in May, and Captain Judith Newford Bruner, Woman Naval Aviator number 2, passed away very unexpectedly in December. In March of 2017, we had the opportunity to honor Lieutenant Commander Rainey, along with the rest of our inaugural group of military women, when Women in Aviation International held their annual conference in Orlando with over 4,500 attendees. Rosemary Mariner, Anna Scott, myself, Jane O'Day, and John Rainey, representing Barbara, and Judy Bruner were inducted into the WAI Pioneer Hall of Fame. And surprisingly, this photo is the first one that shows us all together 44 years after we were selected for pilot training. My dear friend Rosemary Mariner passed away in 2019 after a long and courageous battle with ovarian cancer. But she made history even after her death, when the Navy honored her at her memorial service with the first missing woman flyover, flown by all-women combat-qualified F-18 Super Hornet pilots and launched by an all-woman ground support crew. And one of the pilots for that flyover was Lieutenant Commander Amanda Lee, who now, of course, flies for the Blue Angels. In March of last year, Rosemary was again inducted into the WAI Pioneer Hall of Fame for her decades-long efforts to open the doors for women in aviation. And she held those doors open for everyone who followed. And she was further honored when the Veterans Administration opened a new outpatient clinic in Ventura County and named it after her. Of the 1,255 veterans facilities, this is only the third one to honor a woman. I'd like to conclude my presentation with a final bit of WASP history. When the WASPs were disbanded in 1944, all records of their service were classified and sealed for almost 35 years. Their contributions to the war effort were little known and almost inaccessible to historians. Then, after the Navy opened flight training to women in 1973, the surviving WASPs began to lobby for recognition of their service. And in November of '77, President Carter granted them veteran status with limited benefits. And in 2002, those benefits were expanded to include eligibility for burial at Arlington National Cemetery. But in 2015, the Secretary of the Army tried to rescind that benefit, saying that Arlington was running out of space. I guess he thought that singling out a small group of 90-plus-year-old women wouldn't get much pushback. But he didn't count on the surviving WASPs and the family members of those amazing women, and he didn't count on Colonel Martha McSally, U.S. Air Force retired. The decision to exclude the WASPs from Arlington did not sit very well with Colonel McSally, the first female U.S. fighter pilot to fly a combat aircraft over enemy territory, following the lifting of the prohibition on female combat pilots. With over 100 combat flight hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt bomber, this former Arizona congressman and senator was ready to fight again for the WASPs. And in May of 2016, her legislation successfully passed Congress, and the WASPs are now allowed to be laid to rest at Arlington, a fitting honor for the women who paved the way for the future of all women in military aviation. And it might not have happened without a woman military combat pilot to fight for their cause. As I mentioned earlier, when I left active duty in 1979, it was clear to me that I had won the battle by challenging Section 6015, but that I could not win the war. That would be left to you, every one of you, the talented, dedicated, and courageous women and men who have followed the first 6 into the skies for the last 50 years. Our efforts would not have mattered at all if not for you. Many firsts have happened since I earned my Navy Wings of Gold, and in the future, there will be other challenges to confront. And this past year, I have been privileged to meet many active duty pilots and officers, and there are not enough superlatives to praise them. As long as there are women wearing wings of gold, I know that we can look forward to another 50 years of accomplishments and milestones, not just for women in our Navy, but in all of military aviation. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you today. I can't thank you enough for being here, and it was a distinct honor to have served our Navy and our country. Thank you very much.